Okay, in this segment we're going to look at the end of Martha Nussbaum's chapter on rational emotions, and this segment is called The Judicious Spectator, and it begins on page 72. So she is looking here on how literary readership helps us to discriminate the trustworthy from the untrustworthy. And I really like the way she brings in a thinker like Adam Smith. So let's look carefully at the bottom paragraph on the page. We must begin by noting that Adam Smith, in many respects the founder of modern economics, did not believe that ideal rationality was devoid of emotion. Well, that's refreshing, isn't it, to know that Adam Smith did not believe that rationality was devoid of emotion. And he came up with the idea of the judicious spectator, whose judgments and responses are intended to provide a paradigm of public rationality. So this is extremely useful, I think, because we can say that what is common, what is potentially universal, or at least able to be considered a common human experience, is based on a certain degree on emotions and a certain degree on rationality. So let's look at what she says more about that. And she says that Adam Smith, and this is at the bottom of the first paragraph on page 73. He may, of course, use any information about what is going on that he derives from his own personal history. And this is the judicious spectator that we're talking about. But this information must be filtered for bias in favor of his own goals and projects. On the other hand, he is not, for that reason, lacking in feeling. So the judicious spectator has to use reason to filter out what is and isn't relevant to a certain circumstance. But that doesn't mean he has to rule out feeling. He can include the feeling, and he can judge feeling, and he can decide which one of his feelings is appropriate to include in his decision-making process and which is not. And as good, ethical, intelligent people that continue to grow, we can understand what he's talking about and how she's using Adam Smith's idea of the judicious spectator then. We may get really upset, for instance, at a colleague in our university or in our other place of work. We may feel anger, and that anger may really hit us in the solar plexus, or it may make us feel tingly. We feel our emotions in our bodies. We can, with our rational mind, say to ourselves, yes, I'm feeling angry, but I don't have to react in a way that will make no sense. We don't have to react to make ourselves more vulnerable. We don't have to act in a way that goes against our own internal ethic. We don't have to do anything that we wouldn't ordinarily do, start swearing at somebody or punching them. We may feel like it, but we would not do that, and it's our rational mind that allows us to filter out our raw experience of the emotion from what is useful. However, we may use that anger as a motivator to start a petition, to write to our boss, to ask for a meeting. In terms of social policy, we might approach our senator. We might make a letter or make a meeting. We might write a letter to the editor, and those are all rational actions that we might take, but they might have been fueled by emotion. So the judicious spectator is one who can stand back and say, in terms of viewing something that is very unjust, to say, that makes me angry. And anger is an emotion, but I'm not going to do something rash. I'm going to use that anger to take action. So I'd like to look then with you at page 76 and look at an idea that might be useful as you explore this. So we need to, in the middle paragraph, as she says, exercise critical judgment in our selection of the novels that we teach, and to continue the process of critical judgment as we read in dialogue with other readers. So, and whether it's a novel or it's a dialogue that we have here going on, whether, I've asked you to construct dialogues in your own mind, in your own writing, among the critics that you're reading as if they were guests at your table. So any of those things, we have to, be careful who we invite to our table and use our judgment about that, even in that metaphor. But we have to do so in a community. And then I think it's useful to know that Wayne Booth has aptly called this process co-duction, since it is by its nature non-deductive, comparative type of practical reasoning that is carried on in cooperation with others. So the dialogic model that, say, we talked about in terms of Giles Gunn, who uses Mikhail Bakhtin's dialogic imagination, in terms of that kind of dialogic process, we might carry on a conversation with others, figuratively among those that we're reading, or literally as we come to the table in our Adobe Connect sessions, or actually in person in your own fields of discourse in your everyday lives. Okay, and she goes on to say, in the process of co-duction, our intuitions will be refined by the criticisms of ethical theory and of friendly advice, and thus may greatly alter the emotional experience that we have as readers. So it's not an either-or proposition. The emotions and reason go hand in hand, and the better that we are able to allow them to talk to each other in a dialogic process, the more we can draw upon that co-duction, the more we can draw upon the conversation that we're able to construct in order to make better, more reasoned decisions that might lead better to social justice. I would like to look then to conclude this part of our reading to have you go to page 78. Okay, so she is saying, she's citing a certain legal case. All the opinions in California versus Brown acknowledge a precedent that validate the role of the norm of judicious spectatorship, and also its connection with following the entirety of a complex narrative history. They differ only about whether the instruction as stated, which asks jurors to disregard mere sympathy, would naturally be interpreted to demand the exclusion of appropriate sympathy. The majority opinion holds that jurors would readily see they were being asked to disregard untethered sympathy only, while the dissenters urge that the jurors would not be clear about this, given the way in which the prosecutors standardly represent the instruction. So she's asking us to consider the way prosecutors aren't entirely, neutral in the way that they state their case, and that some people might get swayed by that and not understand the distinction between what is appropriate pity or sympathy and what is inappropriate pity or sympathy in the courtroom. Nussbaum argues that the dissenters are correct and that the jurors would not understand the difference. And she goes on to say, there is great confusion in many people's thought on this point and a corresponding need to clarify the boundaries of appropriate and inappropriate sympathy. And I think this is such an important point, one that I touched on before, not just in terms of Nussbaum, but in terms of everything that we're looking at in this seminar, and that is that we have to respect boundaries and we have to question boundaries. We, even in trying to discover and establish what is appropriate for imagining what is good for oneself and others, as Nicholas Maxwell asks us to do, we have to respect certain boundaries. And I'll go on. Sympathetic emotion that is tethered to the evidence, institutionally constrained in appropriate ways, and free from reference to one's own situation appears to be not only acceptable but essential. Okay, so how do you have sympathy that is not just tied to your own circumstance? Well, through reason, and that's appropriate. We should use our sympathetic capacities that allow us to have an emotional identification with another person, but not to the extent that we're swayed by how that would affect, say our own family member. That's not appropriate. But we should be able to have enough sympathy for the person that we're considering, that is based on a rational judgment of what is appropriate. But it is this sort of emotion, the emotion of the judicious spectator, that literary works construct in their readers. Because we know we're not the character, and we know that whatever's happening to that character is not happening to us. So we have this safe distance. It's called aesthetic distance. And we have a safe aesthetic distance from our characters that allows us this suspension of disbelief, that allows us to have this identification, that allows us to experience the emotion without being taken over by that emotion. So if we were judging somebody, if we were on the jury and we had to be part of the sentencing part of the trial, we would have to take, if we were a judge on the bench and we had to sentence somebody, we would have to be capable of separating that which would take us over and that which is part of a rational person's information, part of the whole picture upon which we must base our decision.